All right. Hello, everyone. We are live here today to talk about AI in business, particularly as it relates to insights, innovation, and strategy. And we have a mix of panelists today who I'll introduce in just a second. But the panelists work in a number of fields, as you will see. We have some in consulting. We have some in more of a product organization, if you will, working from UX to just, again, sort of broader insights. And so we're going to try and cover a bit of a broad spectrum today. Of course, we're not also just focusing on any given tool that is popular at the moment, but really thinking about how AI is going to augment the work we're doing. Hopefully that's not a replacement, and we'll see how everybody feels about that. Hopefully it's an augmentation that helps scale our abilities and increase, what we can do and really improve our research process as a whole. So I'd like to just thank everybody who's out there for attending. You can put comments, on LinkedIn or YouTube, wherever you're watching. They will stream into our platform, sometimes a little delayed, but we will certainly be monitoring those comments, and we'll come back to them at the end. I also, again, would like to just thank the participants for joining, who I'll announce in just a second. And let me just set a little context. So I wanted to put this together today because I've been speaking and writing on this topic a bit. And though I've been largely doing that in the anthropology space, what I'm about to say applies broadly to just the research space, or maybe you might say the social science space, but whatever it may be. And the pitch that I've largely been giving is that, we're going through a sort of a transformational moment, and have been for about 2 years, where businesses have been rapidly adopting various AI across, entire workflows, from marketing and research, you name it, innovation work. And if we as researchers, maybe some of us who have historically spent time in the qualitative research space, don't get on board of that train, we do run the risk of being left behind, because businesses, almost certainly in the name of sort of never-ending growth at lower costs, will likely try to use these tools and methods for insights and innovation work. And so I think we have the opportunity to both study it, as a field site, and contribute to, developing the theory and methods as a field site, but also, of course, using this in the course of our work to, again, sort of expand, our own capabilities. And so with that in mind, I'm largely going to be quiet and try to pull all the expertise out of our wonderful guest today. So we have Larry McGrath, senior researcher at Amazon. So product company, largely working in the UX space, but doing a lot of foundational work over the course of his career. We have Laura Musgrave, who's a lead researcher and consultant at SPARCK. So more on the consultative side and more on the insight side. Tom Hoy, co-founder and partner at Stripe Partners. So bringing a sort of executive level, organizational level perspective to the conversation today, thinking about how not just individuals can use these tools, but also organizations broadly. And then Anna Haverinen of Reaktor, who's a design anthropologist and insight strategist. And so I know I just gave a brief introduction, but I'd like to invite all of the panelists now to just briefly share a little bit more about themselves, and to briefly mention, how you got involved with using AI in your work practice, and just give us a little bit of a taste of how you're using it. So Larry, you want to start?
Sure. My name is Larry McGrath, and I lead user research for Amazon Prime Video, where we've been using conversational AI tools like ChatGPT-4 and Google's Bard throughout our research process. And I think they're fantastic tools. That research process spans 3 phases. The first is template generation, where we're able to get basic research guides or data matrices. And then the second phase will be data analysis. We're using semantic analysis tools or data visualization tools, plugins like Code Interpreter. And then the third and final phase of that research process is stress testing our concepts. And I think conversational AI is great for that. It by no means gets us across the finish line, but it does lend our research team a running start.
Great, thanks. And Anna?
Hi, everyone. Yes, I work at Reaktor, which is a Finnish, but also global, originally from Finland, design and technology agency. And we work with large clients such as HBO, Adidas, H&M. In Finland, we have quite a lot of public sector clients as well. And I have been involved recently in the retail space, where we have been trying to discover the opportunities to use these large language models in, for example, searching products in websites and stuff like that. But we also have quite a lot of experimentation in the health sector, where we're trying to help the clients to discover new ways of trying out this technology. We have been creating proof of concepts, quite many of those the past few months, and understanding that. In my work, I work with strategy, product development, and research. So my role is typically trying to help people to make decisions. Really, the tools and methods vary quite a lot. So, and I have been using this, trying to understand, for example, just the basic desktop research, understanding the environment of the client, getting inspired maybe. New connections, what different data points can give you, and also trying to get away from the fear of the blank page, really, just to get you going on those days that you don't feel at your best. So it's like a clay that you can play with. It's very different for everybody else, but you have the same clay to form something new out of.
Great, thanks. And Tom?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Tom Hoy, co-founder of Stripe Partners. We're a global innovation strategy consultancy based out of London. Yeah, a bit of context, I guess, on where I'm coming from with this. So we started the business about 10 years ago, primarily focused in the ethnographic space, running global ethnographies for product teams in support of product development, product strategy challenges. We then kind of added design capability a few years later, as a natural extension of that, to make the insights more tangible, to help to develop product concepts. And then I guess a couple of years ago, as you alluded to, Matt, we noticed the increasing prevalence of data science and the importance of that in decision-making around product teams. So our question was, like, how can we integrate data science into our practice? So we established a data science team back in 2021. And then most relevant to this conversation, I think we then hired a couple of NLP specialists, natural language processing specialists, Iman and Zoe, last year. And what's been really interesting with them is watching them, starting with the kind of basic algorithms they were trained on, like LDA, starting to adopt, the Google BERT, and then most recently GPT-3 and 4 in the work that they do. And I guess what we're trying to do collectively is figure out how do we integrate these kinds of techniques with ethnography, with design, to drive better outcomes for our clients. And we've started to experiment a lot to do that, and we definitely haven't figured it out yet. But really looking forward to discussing some of the things that we found so far.
Thanks. And Laura?
Hi, I'm Laura Musgrave. I'm a lead researcher and consultant at SPARCK, which is a global design and innovation consultancy, and we design systems, products and services. My particular research specialism is responsible AI, so I'm especially excited by the discussion today because it's research and AI, which are two of my favourite things. It's been really interesting to look at that process of exploring where AI can support our productivity as researchers, and there's a huge variation in the different types of projects and clients that we have across our researchers' work. And so to be able to look at the different phases of the research process and explore how we use different tools in that, and where is AI the most appropriate tool for that task, and if it is, how do we use the right type of AI at the right time? And it's still a bit of a work in progress, as Tom was talking about just then. But there's been various bits and pieces that I personally have been able to use in my work, from things like using machine learning and natural language processing to monitor responses to surveys and studies, whether that's looking for sort of key terms or whether it's highlighting sensitive information if there's a particular project that we're sort of wanting to really monitor quite carefully, through to looking at things like we spoke about analysis, looking at things like sentiment analysis. That's obviously come a long way in recent times. There's sort of some much more sophisticated models available for that now, which can obviously support researchers in their work as well. So lots of different things that we've been looking at and exploring, and some things that we're already putting into practice, other things we're looking at for the future as well.
Great, thanks. And so, Laura, just to stay with that for a second, and maybe we'll kind of loop through all or some, but what do you see, as working well right now, and what do you see that is not meeting your expectations?
I would say that the part just then I was talking about in terms of monitoring text responses, whether that's through surveys or for other forms of research, but being able to flag key terms as they come up, either whether that's because it's a sensitive piece of research and we need to monitor that very closely. That has been a real help for me personally as a researcher, to be able to keep a closer eye on those things, especially when we're looking at a large amount of data as well, and being able to sort of pick up key terms that come up as well. If there's something in particular that we're looking out for, that has worked really well and really made things a lot quicker and easier in that process. Some areas don't seem to be quite, I guess, as up to speed as they might be in the future. So things like transcription, for example, like automated transcription, in some cases it can work quite well, and in others it can struggle. So that's something that probably can still progress over time. And so I find myself not necessarily relying on that so much. But other areas as well. I think those are probably the key ones that are there at the moment. I mentioned the sentiment analysis as well. That's something that definitely has been improving in terms of what's available now for us to use versus maybe where it was a few years ago.
Thanks. And Larry, how about for you?
Rarely in the workplace do we begin with a blank page. Most of our work is done from editing, and historically that would be the place of an archive or a template depository where we would go to our past work or somebody else's and draw upon that in order to produce a new document. I found that conversational AI tools are fantastic, not at taking the place of those archives, but for generating the mundane, oftentimes boilerplate language that we need as a foundation when producing documents, whether that's a preamble, a background statement, a justification of our methods, chunks of texts that endure across documents. And using conversational AI as a tool to generate those also serves as a diagnostic. We get to understand what the mean is, what an average boilerplate statement might look like, and be in dialogue with that as we edit our templates. So setting that sort of textual foundation to our work is where I find AI toolkits to be incredibly valuable.
Great, thanks. And Anna, so maybe building on that and what Larry just said, you mentioned this idea of a ball of clay to work with, which I think is a compelling idea. So again, where are you often starting with molding that, and what's working for you and what's not working?
I've been using multiple services at the same time, trying to use the same prompts, for example, and trying to examine which of the services are understanding the prompt the best. For example, ChatGPT or Perplexity are my two favorites to use at the moment. And since I'm using also Finnish and also English, so I have to be quite mindful also about the language that I am using. And I have a background in discourse analysis and semiotics. So this is very much like a comfort area for me. But with my colleagues, product designers or strategists or something like that, this is not something that they are accustomed to be using or examining, because we have been taught our brains to use keywords and not full sentences. And full sentences are changing the game and changing the way we think and changing the way we communicate with these technologies, and trying to search for the right information or right result to start from. So that's something that I've been trying to understand, in which, like Laura already said, in some cases, the results are amazing, outstanding. And in some cases, even when using the same service, and you would think that I have the really good prompt that I can use, and the results are a utter bollocks, really. So that's something that I'm a little bit concerned, since the quality is not systematically good, and the language is something that makes everything a little bit more different. There are a lot of things that, for example, do not translate from English to Finnish, or vice versa. So that way it makes my work a little bit trickier. A lot of fun though, but trickier.
Yeah, just an interesting point on that. If you look up history of different people in different languages, you actually get different responses, which implies that that those languages are being consumed separately, and it's not that the response is being generated or per se because they're being translated across languages behind the scenes. But so Tom, now to pivot a bit, or to build on all of that, I'm curious to know, so you're trying to implement this, in the organization, and you started with data science in 2021, and you've sort of expanded into, maybe more deeply into the NLP field recently. So you're dealing with same issues around text primarily, or maybe exclusively in some sense there. But where I'm going with this is I'd like to understand what's working, what's not working for you, but also in the context of, where I want to move this is how we integrate this organizationally. Because when I talk to people, it sounds like a lot of people are just trying this tool or that tool, and it's not really operationalized in a way that really maybe accelerates an entire team or practice yet. So any thoughts there?
Yeah, when I was looking back at the different experiments that we've been doing, and I kind of bucketed them into 3 different areas of potential benefits. So the first area, and I think kind of the easiest, but the least embedded, to your point, is kind of speeding up analysis of large, low context data sets. So similar to, I think, what you were talking about, Laura, where you have open-ended survey responses, for example, lots of them, and you need to quickly parse them. And what we found there is that, particularly we did it with BERT, and then more recently with ChatGPT in 3 and 4, things like sentiment analysis and topic modeling, you can do a pretty good job with those models. But when you really, even with ChatGPT 4, when you look at the analysis and look at how things have been categorized, it still gets quite a lot of things wrong. And one of the things there that our NLP experts have been doing is they create this thing called kind of few shot prompting, which is where you essentially train the model to get better. So you take a raw bit of data and show and kind of show what a good analysis looks like, show the model what good looks like, and then run it again, and you get big benefits in performance. But that's kind of the least embedded. I think the other end of the spectrum, which is more multi-level data science kind of project. So one example, which I think might relate to your world as well, Larry, is we worked with a large content platform to help them improve their recommendation system for video. And they have hundreds of millions of videos, billions of videos, 100 millions of users. And it's about how do you match the video with the right user. And what they were interested in is to what extent could you find patterns in the comments of the videos to be able to predict the kinds of needs that particular kinds of videos were fulfilling. So what we did was we created this kind of dual track study where we did some in-depth interviews and mobile diaries with particular users around a particular corpus of videos to understand qualitatively what kinds of video, and there were travel videos, I should have given that context, people looking to explore different destinations, what kinds of different travel videos were addressing different kinds of travel needs. And then we ran the same analysis with NLP via the comments related to those videos and videos like them to spot patterns. And what we found was that there was about 50% of the needs identified in the qualitative work could be identified through the patterns in the comments, which was really interesting. But there was still quite a big gap there. And then we had to augment that with other forms of data science. So we were looking at other attributes of the videos, like the transcripts of the videos, how much the video has been liked, the creator of the video, to then link those other attributes to those other needs that weren't covered by the comments. And then what was really interesting there was then the work the data scientists did to then translate those qualitative insights into things that were legible for the recommendation system for the API. And that was a big piece of work. So we ended up creating this big, what they call a platinum data set, which then they were able to operationalize into their recommendation system. And I think if I could just say kind of one more thing about this, I think what's quite interesting in the area we're exploring is, I don't know if you've come across this this framework called the Cynefin framework. And it talks about the distinction between complex spaces and complicated spaces. And what we see is that a lot of the qualitative work is dealing with parsing complex spaces, which often relate to human systems, which are very qualitative nature and are importantly aren't yet legible to machines. So they're illegible. They're dealing with things that haven't been represented yet in data. And the role of the researcher is the translation between the complex to the complicated. And the complicated realm is a realm of machines which is legible. So how can you translate across those two areas? And I think to your question about how to embed and how to operationalize, I think that's a really useful mental model for thinking about how to do that.
The other thing so thanks for that. And the other thing I think that brings up is the bigger topic of decision making and how that's influencing really decision making within an organization. So I'm curious to hear, are you pretty much, is this a novelty yet, or is this still a novelty, or is this something that is significantly influencing decision-making? I mean, Larry, you want to take a crack at it?
So far, the use of conversational AI tools has been limited to individual contributors at the organization, picking up those tools to help expedite their work. As far as decision-making in the strictest sense, I think that has to be reserved for the prerogative of human judgment. I mean, throughout the history of science and technology, there has been a dividing line between the growth of algorithmic calculation, and as it expands, there's been a deepening of human judgment. Ultimately, it's on the part of humans to make the call as to what's not only right or wrong, but also what's valuable and strategic. And the output of conversational AI tools might bring us up to that point thanks to all of the data it synthesizes. And apropos Tom's comments, those data aren't just numbers, they're also qualitative as well. And I think that conversational AI tools help buttress the authority of qualitative data and not just quantitative data, but ultimately it's up to a human decision maker to make the call.
And just jumping in there, I know I'm the host, but just to add a quick perspective, what I've been basically doing over the past few years now is, say if I was to do a semantic text analysis of all my transcripts, I would do that second. So I would lead with my own process. And then I basically am checking to see is that process, is topic modeling identifying anything that I missed, as opposed to leading with it and almost trapping myself into a bubble that then I presume to be true because of the of the system. Does anybody feel like, would anybody challenge me on that you feel that there's a better approach or another way that you can maybe spar with, a machine in a more elegant way or a more co-creative way? Anybody feel free to jump in on this one.
I think we should take literally that these are conversational AI tools. And much like a natural human conversation, there are multiple phases to it. We don't just have a conversation at the beginning by introducing it, or at the end by wrapping up a dialogue with a partner. There's a process of back and forth between ourselves and a partner, or in this case, ourselves and a chatbot. And so, Matt, you make an excellent point that ChatGPT and other tools might flip over the sequencing within your own work. But ultimately, I think the proliferation of use cases, our proficiency in these tools, relies on coming to see them more and more as a conversational partner and not just one moment in a process.
Yeah, that's great. And that also, I think, relates to another concept of importance, which is, and closely related, but it's creativity. And, Laura, as a fellow musician, she recently won an award. Everybody should go check out her music. But as a fellow musician who's engaged in creative pursuits, how do you, view these tools as, being partners within your creative process?
I find it really interesting because I've obviously been using AI tools within music for quite a long time, and it's almost second nature that they're part of that workflow now. And with research, I'm a lot more cautious about it. And I wonder if it's partly because of that sense of responsibility of it's not just my work, which it is for the music side of things, but it's also that responsibility to the participants. It's the responsibility to your organization, the responsibility to your client if you have one in that project. So it feels like there's a lot more at stake in terms of using AI in research processes, but there are also opportunities there for creativity, much as in the same way with music. And would you like me to talk more about the music side, or shall I continue about the research side in particular?
I mean, if there's a good relationship, I'd say go forward, because I use them too there. And that's in many ways that in photography is where I got started using AI tools, and seeing that gave me a model of how I can co-create, where, the input of one becomes the output of the next, and it's kind of reflexive. So
Yeah.
If you think you can riff on that, go for it.
One thing that I will add to it is that made me realize how much of a role it can play, in the sense of it being a support for the human who is the key decision maker, who is the person who is driving that project. The AI augments the work of the human and can speed up productivity, can add benefits in terms of convenience and other things to that process, but ultimately it's there to support the human in their work. And using it in music has really helped me to understand how the two can work together in a much more fluid way.
Great. And so, and in your work, so far, building on this theme of like it being a partner, I know, again, going back to your comment, you start with the sort of ball of clay, you're having this conversation, as Larry's sort of speaking of, it's a dialogue, right? It's multiple parties involved here, even if one of them is a machine. So tell us a little bit about like, where you take that conversation, and has there been any sort of aha moments or lessons learned so far?
I think most of the aha moments have been when we have been discussing internally how to use this in product development, or in build, like developing the team dynamics, or maybe the capabilities or skills within the team. And that's something that we put quite a lot of love at Reaktor, building the perfect team for a client. And especially in cases where we are maybe trying to validate hypotheses or findings or something like that, we are inclined to use deductive thinking. And when we are creating prompts for ChatGPT or something similar, we are, of course, trying to validate something that we already have in our minds. And this is something that we have been trying to also analyze in which part of the product development we are actually there are more opportunities in inductive thinking, where we are trying to just like immerse ourselves into the data and into the research and into the findings, and form our hypotheses from there. And instead of, as you mentioned already, instead of using the tools too fast, and kind of skipping some parts of the thinking. And that's something that it's kind of it's maybe a personality difference, but also definitely a background and skill differences as well. So that's something that's really interesting in this team.
Great, thanks. And so, I'd like to, Tom, come back to you. And I know that the project you were speaking of, in some sense, already maybe points in this direction. And again, having brought on a data science team as back in 2021, this relates as well. But talk to me about like the cultural change that's taking place. We've already heard now from a few different people that this is sort of I'm doing it this way, maybe another person is doing it this way. It's almost left up to each individual so far. So what are you seeing from the organizational perspective in terms of change?
Yeah, no, it's been great to hear about how the different ways people on this call have been experimenting and how people have been seeing the opportunities, because I think it was something we definitely considered in setting the data science practice up, is the cultural impact on the organization. Because when we talk to our clients, often UX research, data science are very siloed and in fact sometimes quite antagonistic. I hope people won't mind me saying. And it becomes, even if they're working on the same kind of challenges, it can be somewhat competitive with different teams undermining each other or just not collaborating the way they should. I think a lot of that comes down to people's kind of philosophical background, their training. If you're an anthropologist, you can be somewhat skeptical of the way that data scientists might think about how they build knowledge, and vice versa. And I think a lot of that stuff is kind of unspoken, but that has quite a big impact at an organizational level. So what we've been trying to do is create very integrated processes to create a single culture, where we create embedded teams where you have, in the example I gave, qualitative or ethnographic researchers working in tandem with the data scientists, and we'll be, have a daily stand up. We'll pass different tasks. Obviously, each expertise has a different kind of focus, but a lot of it's about in the processes you set up to make sure that you don't have more siloed ways of working. And I think also the thing I'd say on this is, I think if probably everyone's noticed on LinkedIn, research or UX research has had a bit of an existential crisis over the last 6 months with their layoffs. Like, what's going on? Do we not have any business value? And there's been quite a lot of antagonisms, and kind of anger about the fact that the value of the work isn't considered as high as perhaps the people doing it sometimes. And I think there's huge opportunities here, particularly with things like NLP, because I think, Larry, to pick up a point you made earlier, this ability to kind of increase confidence in research findings is massive. Because it's a classic thing. You're never going to get past it. A kind of, an executive or a product director saying, well, you only spoke to 10 people. Am I going to make a multi-million-pound decision on the basis of that? And what this starts to enable us to do is to really augment and build, integrate with other ways of knowing to kind of create that confidence. But you can, as I said before, you only get there by creating processes and project processes that are much more integrated.
If I may interject, amplifying the confidence of qualitative data is absolutely a promise that conversational AI holds to it. Another promise as well is that it can overcome some of the silos that you just spoke to, Tom, because so many symbolic languages no longer have to be mastered by the individual researcher who can use AI instead. I have in mind SQL for data retrieval, or Python and R for data visualization. And these are no longer the exclusive tools of data scientists. If anything, I hope that conversational AI tools will boost the value of natural languages and not just symbolic languages, especially as we translate these models into more languages, including Finnish and more throughout the world.
So just picking up on that, again, we had that example earlier of Finnish, and of course, as everybody has probably read, these tools are just sort of statistically, counting, right, or projecting the next word. And so that's why Finnish is different than English. And so that then brings up the very common, comment about hallucinations. And that is obviously real, but that also presumes, we're talking about conversational AI today, which is only one body of AI. There's another body of symbolic AI, coming back, Larry, to your point, and or tangential point. And so, right now there's this sort of focus on what large language models can do and the ability for them to statistically project the next word and the fact that it's inaccurate. But that actually also sort of handicaps us from thinking about the fact that instead of internalizing all of the knowledge into a model and then trying to, compute something at a high environmental cost, we can also externalize knowledge into graphs and connect graphs and large language models together. And so I don't want to just get sort of bogged down only on the idea, or just this for all the listeners, that like large language models are the only path forward here. There's still multiple branches of AI that are very relevant. Computer vision is going to deeply impact what we do from a video and visual image perspective, and how we bring that into our work. Knowledge graphs or symbolic AI are really going to come in and bring, improve the reasoning ability of large language models and the subject matter expertise. And those are all great places for all of us to work as researchers. And so with that being said, I'd like to maybe just talk about, moving beyond that, this sort of just text analysis perspective that we've talked a little bit about so far, and really be thinking about, okay, so, we have some new tools for insights. We have even new field study, if you will, place to play. But how is this really going to drive innovation and strategy, right? How is this going to directly impact the work that we do going forward? And so, Anna, do you want to maybe, jump in there with any thoughts?
We actually have my current project is a very good example of that with the retail client that we have. We had ideas that it may work on cases like such and such. And we didn't have, it's a small project. It's a kind of like a strategy consulting project where the client wants to have concepts from their ready-made strategy that the other company has already made for them or with them. And they wanted to have more tangible, more kind of like a service concept ideas made from the strategy. And we have been doing that. And we didn't have software developers in the team. But we had ideas that we were able to try out with the different services that we have been using conversational AIs and different visual tools just to see what's possible and to create kind of like a bridge in our thinking without the need of actually having like a software developer always saying, no, it's not possible, or yes, that's possible. So it gives a little bit more room to play with and a little bit more reliability in the process that we have been using in the concept phase as well. But also I wanted to note something that I noticed in May when I was preparing material for a local workshop here in Turku, where I live. And I was preparing for materials, how to create a research prompt in ChatGPT or Perplexity or something like that. And my initial idea was to frame the exercise in a way that the machine is giving you a list of questions, and they're pretty good questions, actually. And the following prompt for the list was that, okay, now make the list of research questions into more ethnographic and kind of like showcase how well the machine actually knows how to like shift the mindset. And my initial idea was also to highlight the importance of ethics in this case. But a week later, when I had the actual workshop and we were doing the exercise, the responses already had incorporated the ethic discussions that I was supposed to have with the participants. So the speed, how fast this technology is changing and adapting also to the needs of its users is something that makes it a little bit tricky to use, since when we try out something and we feel that, okay, it's not good enough, we might not try it again. And experimentation takes time. So how do we allocate more time to trying out these existing services all over again and all over again, all over again? Like, is it good enough now? Is it good enough now? So that's something that we also might need to consider when using these services. I don't know if you picked up what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thanks. And I mean, Tom, I'm sure you're going through some of that as well, organizationally. Any thoughts there?
So just to clarify, the question is about the kind of ethical side or a different aspect?
Yeah, maybe more on the how fast the technology is actually changing, because my initial idea was to give the ethical discussions as a human in the loop, because the machine didn't do it, but a week later it did. It already gave the instructions how to use the research questions in an ethical way. And it was also reflecting how wise it is to use a machine to create these research questions as well. And this was in ChatGPT 3.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think the trajectory of this stuff, I mean, as I said at the start, I think the, when we first hired Iman and Zoe, the NLP specialists, they were working with algorithms like LDA, which has been around for many years, which is a way for doing things like topic modeling. And now they've only recently started to integrate these other more recent models, and they've been super impressed by, the leaps that, things are going through. I think what it does do is just really clarify what the benefit of the human in the loop is from a research perspective. I think it's really important. And I think those tasks that I mentioned at the start, like the summarization of the analysis of low context data sets, I think stuff like that will just get better and better until to the point where it is, replicable to a researcher being able to look at a list of data they don't have a lot of context around and be able to categorize it or do sentiment analysis. I think what it enables us to do then is to clarify what the real benefit of the human is. And I think there's a really useful concept. I don't know if anyone's came across this psychologist called Stephen Harnad, who was writing a lot in the 1990s, and he informs a lot of the debates around this technology at the moment. And he came out with this concept called symbol grounding problem. And really what he's saying is that language is ultimately a symbolic system, and it has no inherent meaning until it's used in a specific context. And I think what it does is clarify the role of the researcher as providing that specific context. And then the way to think about that specific context is in two different ways. The first is in terms of the world that you're trying to understand. So particularly if you're doing ethnographic work, right, you can add the layer of behavior, you can add the layer of social cultural context, you can add the layer of intent to kind of understand and understand what of the outputs I'm getting from these models, what's important, what's not important. How can I triangulate that to the stuff that I'm seeing? We've actually had a bunch of examples. One I've got in mind in particular in the healthcare space, where we did some analysis of some Reddit forums around a treatment of a particular condition, and it surfaced issues that we hadn't surfaced in the in-depth ethnography we've been doing. And it actually identified lots of issues. But the trick was using the ethnographic grounding to kind of triangulate that's important, that's not important. And then the other side of the coin, right, is the organizational context. So what's the politics of the client organization if you've got a client or just an organization you're working on? Who are the stakeholders? What's the strategy? Because that then again informs what's important, what's not important. And it's the researcher that has that context, that nuanced context from both sides of the coin. And that isn't going to get replaced for the foreseeable future. So it's really doubling down on this and kind of seeing it through the lens of impact. Is I can triangulate to increase the impact that this work's having, but almost use it to kind of give you superpowers in that capacity.
And so just building on that, one of the themes that to me comes out through most of this conversation is trust in, the data, the output, if you will. But there also has to be a trust between us and our stakeholders. So whether that's, we're working internally at a product organization and we're working, with some other team or embedded, or we're a consultant and we have a client. So, for those who are, I guess this could be a question for anybody. Is anybody already making it clear that they're using this in your work? And, how have those other stakeholders felt about you making use of such tools? And has there been any considerations of trust, and how have you dealt with those? And anybody can take that.
I mean, I can talk very quickly from the perspective of I guess, kind of selling this into client organizations. So it's definitely been a process, and we started by actually just doing some of this work for free, and actually doing appendixes to reports we've been writing, decks we've been creating, and saying, oh, here's this NLP analysis we've also done that adds value, to kind of just demonstrate what the value is. And from there, and then since then, we've started to actually figure out how to position it, how to sell it, what to different kinds of stakeholders. I think there is, going back to the cultural question, if you're talking to kind of UXR people, particularly with, say, like PhDs in anthropology, etc., it can be quite tricky because they might not necessarily intuitively agree with it as a methodology. So you need to find ways of talking about how it can benefit them and how it doesn't replace the other side, the other work that's being done, but rather improves it, strengthens it, gives it more clout, etc. But that's been quite an interesting process in that, from that trust perspective of how do you build the trust around these new methodologies, actually trying to sell it to people.
And it's important not only to trust the output, that is something we lend to these platforms, but also trust our own responsibilities over the input. Using conversational AI in an organization means that for researchers, we better scrub any information about our human subjects when it comes to data. We can't be sharing intellectual property with these models. So effectively articulating the prompts so that they are in fact trustworthy and we are so as users, I think, is another side of the problem that's important.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to ethics, and it's funny because ethics always gets dealt with last. And so I might just want to punt on that for a minute, but definitely, Laura, we'll want to come back to you on the responsible AI front. But before getting there, I just want to come back to sort of like a thread of an idea that I previously tried to get out, which is strategy. So, we've talked a lot about how we use this to guide the insights, but is anybody also, how are you taking that and really then turning that into sort of a tangible decision, or really, I don't want to say decision, really a tangible strategy. And by strategy, I don't mean a set of decisions or goals. I really mean, how are you going to create sustainable competitive advantage so you win? Like the real sort of business classic definition of strategy, so that we're really going to create, winning companies or winning products. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Are you taking it and really using the insights to guide that, or is it still just, fodder for thought at the moment, and not being pulled all the way through?
I could jump on that. Yes, definitely. It will help. I haven't had the chance to properly use it in a client case for full scale strategy or something like that. But especially in cases where we try to understand something in a way that you do not know what you do not know. So when we're doing, for example, ethnographic research for a strategy case or something like that, we are already limited with the perspectives and the diversity and the skills of the team and maybe the industry of the client or something like that. So oftentimes, what Tom already described in the healthcare sector case, using those technologies, you can find something that you wouldn't initially think in an ethnographic setting or something like that. So there's definitely more space to explore, more space to understand, especially the silent triggers, the little pieces of information that might lead to some really big changes in some areas of business or even industries. So that's something that I would be personally really interested to explore with some clients.
Great. And so you mentioned changes. And so I know we have a few anthropologists on the call, and a lot of anthropologists don't like futuring for understandable reasons. But if we had to go somewhere, what do you see? How do you really see this changing everything? And I don't mean necessarily just conversational AI as it is today. But do you see anything bubbling up where how you would predict of how this is really going to radically disrupt research and business and the way that drives ultimately innovation and strategy work? And building on that, is there anything that you think you'd want people to hear so that they're preparing for their own careers, whether retraining or repositioning?
A little bit context to my answer. I have a classical anthropology training, and I did archaeology as a minor and museology. So I had the full Indiana Jones package, and ended up working in IT consultancy. So life happens really. And the applied anthropology field here in Finland is pretty much non-existent in terms of academic training. There isn't any. You're basically offered a career either in research or in museum sectors or maybe cultural heritage or something like that. So I'm not necessarily looking for innovative changes in the applied sector or in the business sector or something like that. There's always something interesting to dive into, but I would really, really love to see the birth of applied anthropology through this technology here in Finland, because it makes knowledge much, much more accessible than just like Googling around blindly and trying to, it would have probably help students to also overcome their own biases. There's a lot of students who think that everything private sector is spawned from Satan or something like that. I think we're all familiar with that attitude. So, and that's very much still alive here. And I would love to change that, because not all private sector, we can do a lot of good as well, and help people pay taxes as well. So I would love it to change maybe the education of anthropology.
Great, thanks. Anybody else want to jump in with any thoughts on where this is all going?
I think for me it's really exciting, because if anything, our experience have reaffirmed the value of the kind of training you just talked about, Anna. It's like, it's more important, not less important. There was this existential crisis with like, oh my gosh, are we going to get just replaced by large language models as researchers? But I think for the reasons I talked about, that isn't the case, precisely because we have this ability to pass context, whether that's organizational context or user context, to make this stuff valuable. I think the risk is the same one you talked about, Anna, which is that there's this kind of, what's the right way to put it? Distaste for the technology for kind of epistemological reasons, which then means the technology is taken by people from other disciplines, whether that's data science or market research or other spaces. I'm making it sound quite antagonistic, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that people need to lean into it, experiment with it, show how they can augment it, and it will put them into a greater position of power, I think, if they do that, versus trying to maintain boundaries and prove existing methodologies as being superior and not experimenting. Because I think that if that happens, then you will be on the losing side of the battle, I think. So I think that's what I'd say about it.
And just a quick follow-up to that. Overall, what's the response been from the clients? I mean, I know you've said that you kind of initially threw it in as the appendix, but has it been, warm response since then?
Yeah, I think it has. I think it's still early days, isn't it? I think it depends on the client slightly and their kind of mentality and what they see the value in, and also their stakeholders, right? Has this helped them have impact? Has this helped them sell in a particular strategy? And so far, the answer has generally been yes. To your question earlier, I don't think thankfully, it's not replacing the other stuff. It's not superseding it necessarily. It's more about supporting, adding confidence, augmenting, increasing the surface area, these other kinds of things that make the work seem more impressive. So yeah, there's definitely value there. And I think there's lots more value that hasn't been quite figured out yet to come.
Great. And so, obviously the next phase then for us is moving beyond everybody sort of playing with their own tools, having to not make sure we put in PII, into something like a chat interface, which of course there is ways around, right? You can use the API, you can, there's even interfaces that give you the interface of say ChatGPT, but it goes through the API to preserve your data. But nonetheless, I guess where I'm going with this, and maybe Larry, I don't know if you want to talk about it in the context of your organization, which is a quite sizable organization. There's obviously like room for, maybe like, maturity here, just like UX matured and just like any discipline matures. And so, from again, slightly futuring perspective, what do you see the future of like a maturity model being within your organization?
Well, the phase of maturation that we're in right now as we integrate AI tools into our practice is developing protocols for their use. That particularly has to do with prompt generation, whether it's identifying the appropriate tone, the format, or the modes and roles for the queries that we make. And so I think level setting across the board so that there is an equal skill set among the practitioners of these tools is really important to help move us beyond, as you've been alluding to, Matt, this phase of immaturity, where these tools have just been the prerogative of individual contributors at a company.
Great. And now building on that, there's the question of ethics for sure. And so again, you mentioned earlier, PII, but what else are you thinking about? I mean, of course, there's issues of, bias in the data, which we know that the internet is biased. Arguably, something we've always known and doesn't necessarily change, or is not going to change anytime soon. There's issues of privacy, which you alluded to, right? There's issues of transparency of within models like this. So there's lots of issues to deal with, as well as the sort of more existential threats of they're very complicated. So people use them for, rewriting a few sentences, and that has a large impact. To put it through all sort of, through the whole model, just for that has a significant climate impact. So any thoughts, on, aside from privacy, which you've mentioned, what you're considering and what you're concerned about? And Laura will relate this back to responsible AI.
Yeah, sorry, was that over to me? I wasn't sure if you were asking Larry again.
Sorry, yeah, I was. Sorry, Larry, if you want to maybe just elaborate on that, and then Laura will come over to you with your thoughts on responsible AI.
You.
I have a lot of faith in the civil society and state institutions that are tackling ethical issues. When it comes to civil society, I think Tim Nickabrew's work for the Distributed AI Research Institute is fantastic. Or recently, President Biden implemented the blueprint for AI bill rights. I think a lot of the ethics additionally depends on our ethics of selfhood as we practitioners engage with conversational AI, incorporating it into our practice to remain true to our disciplines as well. You made a reference earlier to the anthropologists here. And so I think making sure not to diminish the value of anthropological insights, to instead make sure that conversational AI is a true conversational partner where we contribute our disciplinary knowledge. I think that takes the form of using these tools to focus on the hard cases where meaning, intention, interpretation are at stake. We lived through, over the past 50 years, an explosion of big data thanks to increasingly fast chip computing or the expansion of cloud storage. We're now in an era where we as humanists and social scientists can instead not focus on the big data, but focus on the thick data and remain true to our disciplinary knowledge. And I think that is an ethical concern that we should embrace.
And just to pick that up before we dive much deeper on the ethics, so of course, training data is critical to this. And Tom, you alluded to sort of the few shot training that you're doing. So fine tuning models with our own data could be particularly helpful. And, I've advocated that we need like a sort of disciplinary wide model. I know there's great challenges there, and the likelihood of that really happening is challenging. Though it will be, I'm sure in the very near future, we will see fine-tuned models within each organization that, really serve the purpose of potentially even teams. But how else do you think, aside from fine-tuning and something else I already mentioned, which is knowledge graphs, which is a tremendous benefit to large language models. Anybody have any other thoughts on how we can make these more anthropological? Because, I don't think anybody will debate that they're not very anthropological today. So how can we bring in the sort of meaning and context and not just have, Larry, you said it, and somebody recently said it to me, sort of like the mean of the conversation showing up over and over again. How can we really make sure that we identify and embrace the outliers that so often give us those aha moments? And I'm open to anybody who feels they want to jump in.
Yeah. I mean, I guess a lot of this stuff, the proof will be in the pudding, in the sense there will be certain use cases where you can create closed loop systems and you can apply these models and they produce better results, whether that's in a kind of recommendation system context or any other context. And where that's the case, they will be adopted because it's cheaper and faster and better. But as I said before, I think what I'm confident about is that in more abstract, as I've said before, complex problem spaces that haven't been made legible yet, that is where the research will thrive. And that's where the models haven't been trained yet. And I think one interesting way to think about the role is that you are the ethnographer is the person that's going out to map the terrain, to create the platinum data set, to be able to find knowledge that doesn't exist yet on the knowledge graphs, right? Like, because you're researching a new technology that's never been used before, or you're exploring a particular cultural context that hasn't been mapped yet, because you're looking at a particular kind of user group that's quite specific and quite niche. And then you're using these tools to then scale that knowledge, to add confidence to that knowledge, to be able to contrast that knowledge. And ultimately, as I said before, that the benefit of that is only, again, going to be in the proof is in the pudding. Does that drive more successful products, more successful services? My hunch is that it will, and it will continue to do so. So that's where the value will be, I think. So now pivoting from there to responsible AI, so much of this is really predicated on the idea of, the data that belongs to others in many ways. And I know we capture a lot of that as part of our process. But, I think we also need to maybe recognize, who we are building value on the backs of with some of these tools. And there are lots of other things to consider, some of which we've already mentioned. But Laura, do you want to maybe just, for those who potentially out there are new to the space, you want to just talk a little bit about, what you mean by responsible AI, and, sort of set a little context for us in that area?
Sure. I think there's many different aspects to it, as you mentioned, Matt, and all of us today have spoken about this in some form, whether it's privacy, or whether it's the transparency side of it, the bias. There's a lot of different factors that we need to consider. And a big part of us using AI is that we need to understand, at least in principle, how it works, and to be able to understand the potential benefits, but also the risks, and how it's all been created, as you say, Matt, because there's a lot behind the scenes that also happens to enable these models to work. And so having at least a little bit of a sense of that is really important. Whether that's in terms of the privacy side of things. So we've spoken a lot about data, really considering, what type of data are we using? Is this the right use for this data and for this tool in the research process? Who is that data being shared with? For what purposes? And would your organization or your client or your participant be surprised by the data that you're sharing and where it might turn up again? Because that's another factor also that Larry touched on earlier on, that if you're putting in, whether it's personally identifiable information, or if it's organizational or client data that's proprietary, that could potentially turn up elsewhere if you're adding it in. So those types of things to be aware of. Also thinking about bias, we talked about that. Wherever you've got sort of AI working, there can also be incidents where it makes recommendations that are unfair, or produces things that are unfair to certain individuals or certain groups. And so it's really important to be aware of that, because of the scale that AI operates on, and that can have a really significant impact. So we need to be very conscious of that. And you'll see, I know Anna was talking earlier on about earlier versions of some of these large language models. You'll see that in more recent iterations of those, some messages have been added, some guardrails have been added to try and reduce the risks of that happening. And it's definitely something that can still happen, and there are recent examples of it occurring, which, if you want to go and look up, you can. But there are signs that as the models are kind of progressing and as the systems are being improved, there are measures being taken to try and reduce some of these things happening but they do still happen, and it's something that we need to be quite conscious of, especially if we're rolling out some of these systems at scale. We need to be able to take steps to try and reduce some of those risks, because otherwise it can be quite hidden and we can not always realize that it's happening. Transparency was another thing, Matt, that you mentioned, and that sort of takes a couple of different forms. One is the transparency in how the system itself works, but also transparency in us using it. And I think we touched on that earlier on. Matt, you asked, are your clients aware that you're using it? So things like that, do you need to check with your organization or your client, especially if it's being used on individual levels? Is there any kind of process, or is there any kind of guidelines on that and how it should be used? Lots of different things. There's probably a lot more we could talk about as well, but I think the key things are we need to understand some of the key issues with some of these tools as well as the benefits, because we're only going to get the effectiveness and we're only going to make the most of those types of tools when we can address some of these things as part of that process and work out, is this the right tool? Does this take us towards or away from our standards for our research? So, for example, if we're choosing a particular type of AI to use at a particular point in the research process, is that helping us to, for example, be more accurate, or is it reducing the accuracy for that particular task? So these are all big questions to grapple with, but it's really important that we do discuss them and that we do look at them in the use of these tools.
One thing I think is interesting to point out is all of these issues are very old in the AI space, right? We've seen these all show up in all the machine learning models that have powered the products that we have used for years. And in some sense, I appreciate that large language models made a jump forward with the invention of transformers, but it's almost as if this is actually a bigger UX revolution than it is an AI revolution in some sense, in that it's the chat interface and using, human language, which is so natural, obviously, to us, is really, in many ways, the big change that has brought this to everyone, right? That allowed something like ChatGPT to scale so quickly. And so those guardrails that you're describing, I mean, I'm not suggesting that there shouldn't be measures on the back end that improve these models, and to a degree the guardrails are that, but it's in many ways also up to us to figure this out on sort of the front end and how we guide users as well. So I don't think we should also just assume that it's purely a dev responsibility in some sense either. But nonetheless, so anybody else have any thoughts on ethics at all, or anybody want to jump in and piggyback on any of that? Okay, if not, so I want to just give a shout out. If anybody is listening that wants to ask a question, please do just drop that in the chat and we'll monitor that. Otherwise, from a closing remarks perspective, I'd love to have maybe just everybody in a minute or two, share what interests or what jumped out at them today, and what they're excited about, or just something that maybe didn't come up that you want everybody to know, however you want to approach that, but sort of just, your summary of what you learned and what you're excited for. So Larry, maybe you want to take that?
I thought it was fantastic hearing about some of the projects that my co-panelists have been pursuing with OpenAI. I think OpenAI and Google's BARD as well. I think that the expansion of more specific use cases, as opposed to talking about these tools generically or abstractly, is going to be key to their successful and ethical integration into our practices. One of those use cases where we're using AI tools right now at Prime Video Sports is better understanding community, the social bonds that bring together fans, not just for their own team, players, cities, or countries, but also other hidden forms of community that we've been able to tap into thanks to AI tools such as rivalry and opposition, and integrating those into our sports offerings. And so I really think that the future of successful AI use, especially as we bring it in dialogue with our humanistic and social science background, is going to depend on making more explicit all of these use cases.
Okay, and Anna?
I was thinking about the diversity aspect, not only the diversity and the quality of the data that we are using with these technologies, but also the individuals contributing to the data. And what Laura just perfectly described, all the aspects that is necessary to have responsible AI and responsible process of using AI as well, that will require new ways of thinking, new ways of creating these solutions as well. So it's a process of trial or error, but also learning from something that's not maybe already embedded in the team or in the organization or in the company, recognizing the skills that are missing, that are necessary, for example, creating a responsible way of using the AI, and also the diversity of using the AI as well. So there are lots of opportunities, but also being mindful of the risks as well.
Great. And Tom?
Yeah, I think to the point I made earlier, I've been really excited to hear how everyone's been talking very specifically about specific experiments they've been doing, and the conversation's moved. I think if we'd had this conversation even 3 months ago, it would have been at a much more generic level, broad brush kind of rejection or acceptance, and not much nuance. And I think the fact that we haven't even questioned whether this is useful or not is in itself quite telling. I think now it's accepted that it is. And to Larry's point, now it's about finding the specific use cases and contexts where it has value, And I think we've started to surface those. But what I would also say is that, in our own practice, it still feels very early. And I think we still need to be in this more expansive mode of experimentation, learning what works, what doesn't work, and then not trying to kind of ossify things too quickly. And then finally, I just reiterate this point about, UX researchers in particular leaning into this stuff, not rejecting it, not thinking it's the realm of data science. And where it is, I think it's then about collaborating with those data scientists and thinking, how can we integrate our processes to get more value out of this stuff? So those would be my key messages.
Yeah, and if I could just piggyback real quick, I mean, I'm not suggesting that all researchers or qualitative researchers are going to be sense. Laura, you want to maybe jump in and just share your closing thoughts?
Sure. So I think there's been a lot of great discussions today on different ways of using AI. I agree with a lot of the comments already that it's very much going to be a multidisciplinary approach that really, I guess, progresses this and actually makes it useful on a much larger scale rather than just sort of individuals. I think that's where we're going to see a lot more value, is when we're starting to bring together that diversity that Anna talked about, and as Tom was talking about, the cross disciplines, working together using these types of tools. So there's a lot of value in that, and I think there's a huge amount of things happening at the moment in terms of that technological progress, but I think also for us to understand as well what's happening, be able to look at it realistically, as Anna was talking about, looking at both the risks and the potential opportunities that it offers, and there's a healthy dose of both, and being able to kind of cut through some of the hype around what it might do or what it might achieve in the future. I think we kind of need to go into it with a healthy dose of curiosity, but also a healthy dose of caution as well, and really weigh up, what are those use cases, like Larry was saying, that we can actually practically make use of this type of technology.
Great. And so we have some questions coming in. Anna, I'm going to pick this one up first because it just it just piggybacks on a few thoughts that were just said. So Melissa is asking, following up on your earlier comment about the sort of pace of change here.
Yes, that's definitely something that when we are trying to learn different opportunities of this technology, and at the same time, as a consultant, I need to be billing. There's a certain amount of time that I can only carve out to test and try out and learn the different services, because not all of them are usable in the client cases, or some of them can be embedded in the billing anyway. But nevertheless, I have to be cautious of my time. And if something that I used last week I have deemed to be not usable in the future, and now it has changed already within a week, how do I know that? How do I get back to some service and try it again if I have tried it out? Do I need to make a list of these and maybe stamp dates or when I have tried them out, and whether they still fit the purpose or need to be adjusted or something like that? Because we only have certain amount of favorite tools in our tool set, and that's something that I would like to maybe learn from others. Do you have any tips or tricks or best practices that you have learned during the past few months or years even?
Yeah, well, and I'll just bring in another question here, and I'll defer to you all to answer that. But from Autumn, we have a question of single favorite AI tool. So maybe there's the response to Autumn and also the response to Anna.
Unfortunately, I haven't been able to use any type of analysis tool yet. Really looking forward to try out some of the automated video editing services, especially in cases where we are documenting some kind of observations through video, and maybe creating stories to the client through those video footages. So I'm really interested trying out those services. Maybe speeds up the editing. I'm not a very good editor of video, so I have a story in my mind, but the machine would make the edit for me. And also, especially the text analysis cases that Tom already has described very well. So I'm really, really interested to be exploring those. So,
well, just to jump in there, for editing video, if you're not using it, I use Descript. And so you're editing based on text instead of actually based on video. So you just delete words and it's going to splice the video together.
Okay.
So you're just editing around the text. So it's a much easier interface for many people.
Fantastic.
So I want to check that out. So coming back to Autumn's question, if anybody wants to jump in, any favorite AI tools that you're already using?
I think, like, at a personal, as a consultant at a personal level, you can't really beat ChatGPT as a mean. I think particularly at the beginning of projects. So as a consultant, you're often shifting between different problem spaces to get to that kind of mean knowledge point, to like know what is it that most people know about this particular topic, and you can be very specific about it. It just gets you up to speed so much more quickly than you would have been able to otherwise. And then by dint of that, you can then understand what are the gaps, like what are the things that people don't know, where can I offer value as a consultant or as a researcher to add to that knowledge base. So I think at a foundational level, that's been really useful to me.
And we're only beginning to see what plugins for ChatGPT are capable of. One that I love is Code Interpreter to provide basic data and generate a host of data visualization artifacts, pie charts, line graphs, scatter plots. Not that I have to use them, but at least I'm exposed to the spectrum of possibilities for splicing and dicing my data. I think there's still so many more fantastic plugins that have yet to be developed.
Yeah, certainly the plugin ecosystem within ChatGPT is interesting, but also you should look at. I would just comment or just add that don't disregard browser plugins. So like Tom, what you were just talking about, you were essentially referring to summarization. And so I use GPT for Sheets, which I can bring in then to Google Sheets. And then it connects to the API. So I have a larger context window, so I can look at more text than you would be able to in the chat interface. And I can summarize larger bits of it quicker. And you can sort of then just put all of your text in different cells, and, you just drag down your prompt, write down a column, and then you basically get your output across all of them pretty quickly. And so I would say, obviously ChatGPT is going to probably come up for many, but there are many tools beyond that. And there are many different ways of even using that tool itself or the sort of 3.5 or 4.0 models at this point. So I would definitely give those all consideration. And we had another question that I think Larry might be best to come your way. Any reflections around best practices for rolling out AI at an organizational UX research level?
Yeah, that's a great question. Protocol development is one key aspect of making AI tools not only widely used and understood, but setting expectations for them as well. And so I think that's one of the key elements. Hosting workshops around AI tools is also something that we've been doing. All of this, as was discussed earlier, in the interests of moving the use of these tools beyond individual contributors to a point where they're seen as accepted practices within the organization.
Great, thanks. And so if anybody has any last questions, please do drop them in the chat. We're happy to answer them. We have a few minutes left for the scheduled session. I'd also just put it out to anybody who's, any of the participants today. If there's any questions or comments that you had that you want to just jump in with as a follow-up to maybe something that any of the other participants said, please also feel free. Otherwise, if I don't see anything, maybe I'll just summarize and we'll wrap up a few minutes early. So I know, there's obviously been a lot that's been said over the past nearly hour and a half. I think for me, some of the things that come out is a comment, Tom, you just made that, nobody's really challenging the value, right, of this sort of approach. But it seems like the next question is in many ways, how do we operationalize and mature this and sort of bring it to the organization so that we do have kind of a continuity across that, benefits, all parties individually, but also benefits the organization, that maybe adds some, ethical thinking, around what we're doing as organizations, protect anything from PII to name any of the other problems we brought up. But then I think there's also the opportunity, and I'll just maybe end with this, that, we're talking a lot about using this sort of in the course of our work, but I want to just give a shout out to an idea that I'm been pitching that I think we need to also be contributing to building these products. And I appreciate, Tom, you're sort of doing that in a sense as a co-founder. But I'm thinking more so in a sense that I think there's an opportunity here for us to productize, these tools on the back of sort of a social science perspective and start product companies, not just research consultancies, but product companies that really help lead the way. And I'd be very, encouraged to just chat about that with anybody, even just to kick ideas around. But I think, instead of just relying on, others to produce these tools and us figuring out how to use it, I would like to just encourage everybody to really think about how we can build them ourselves, right, and lead that development so that we have, the most ideal amount of influence there. So I'll leave it with that. Anybody else have any last things they want to say? All right, I think we're good then. So thanks everyone out there for joining us. Appreciate you all taking the time. Please follow up with myself, or I presume everybody else is open to people reaching out. I'm sure we're all happy to answer questions or comments. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Matt,
Thanks very much.
great.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.